I hope you'll find it of interest, and I want to particularly thank Karen, who's helped me put all the slides together, and she's doing the technology for this here. So firstly, it's a very, very personal story about revolution, occupation, and survival. And maybe Karen can put up slide 1, which is the cover of the book. Okay, and featured on the front cover of the book are my grandparents, whose story this really is, actually. And we've got this picture enlarged here. This is them on the front cover of the book in Paris. The book was published in 2018, many years after it was bequeathed to me by my dear mum, who passed away in 2001. It was only after my younger brother died in 2014, and I inherited all the family photos and papers, that I realized I was the last one left in the family. And if I didn't do something about it, this memoir would disappear into the ether. And I felt duty bound to fulfill my mother's wish of having her manuscript published for posterity. She was passionate about the fact that we had a rich heritage which should not be forgotten. We didn't originate from Northwest London, even though we were now living there. Our roots lay somewhere totally obscure in Uzbekistan, for we were Bukharian Jews. Bukhara, Tashkent, Samarkand, Kokand were all words that we as children heard around our home, as indeed was Bukharian, a language our parents spoke if they didn't want us to understand what they were saying to one another. My mother, Tamara, was the second child of Aron and Adina Abramoft, who are featured on the front cover of the book. Karen, too quick with the slides. My mother was the second child of Aron and Adina Abramoft, who are featured on the front cover of the book. My mother writes the memoir as though she is her own mother, recounting Adina's life from before her marriage to Aron to his final days in Paris. So I picked up my mother's manuscript, which had been handwritten in Russian. I found the floppy disk onto which an English translation had been stored, and I set to work. I looked at all the family photos, and I selected those that I thought would enhance and explain the story, labeling them all, trying to find out who all these people were in the photos. And I realized that my mother was helping me all the way, for she'd written in Russian on the reverse of many of the photos saying who these people were. At the same time, I was approached by several of my cousins, who had now become grandparents, and who knew that over the years my mother had written down the family history, who wanted to relate the story of their grandparents' life to their grandchildren, something that had now become important to them, as there was no one left in the family to answer those questions you wish you'd asked when they were alive. Once I started working on this project, I was also encouraged by many friends, some of whom have joined us today, to publish the book, as they thought it was an untold story that people would be interested in. I wasn't so sure, so I'm grateful for their encouragement. It was a journey of discovery for me too. Although my mother was a raconteur who would regale us with stories of her childhood in Russia, she only selected the happy times. I had no idea until I read and reread the memoir how difficult their lives had been. In fact, my grandparents too, whose story this really is, whom we used to visit in Paris at least once or twice every year during my childhood, never alluded to the difficulties they'd gone through. They were always happy and welcoming, and there was no inkling of what terrible things they'd gone through. Perhaps they just wanted to put it all behind them and not burden the younger generation with their sadness. Anyway, back to the book. The subtitle of the book is The Story of a Bukharian Family's Triumph Over Adversity. Let me explain a little bit about Bukharian Jewry. Bukharian Jews are Sephardi Jews who take their name from a town which is now in Uzbekistan called Bukhara. Now, if we look at the map on there here, you can see, as Karen's pointing out, there is Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan, in fact, was part of Russia at one point, and all that area bordered on Afghanistan and Iran was the area all inside Russia. Of course, it's all been changed now since the fall of the USSR. It's on the Asian side of Russia, not the European side where most Ashkenazim have their roots. It borders Afghanistan and Iran, as I said, and the area is known as Central Asia. If we have a look at the third slide now. So this is an enlarged map of Uzbekistan itself, and the four main cities in here and where the Bukharian Jews take their name from. If you see, there's Bukhara on your western side on the left, Bukhara, going across then to Samarkand. And then you go up to Kokand, and then the last one, Tashkent, which is further up there. And the story about my grandparents is based upon Tashkent and Kokand. Those are the two stories. My own father actually was born in Bukhara. So a little bit about Bukhara itself. The first positive evidence of a Jewish community of Bukhara dates from about 1240. And at the end of the 16th century, the Bukharian Khanate was established as the center of Islam in the country, in the region. Jewish residence was restricted to a special quarter, and they were prevented from acquiring land and houses from Muslims. They were compelled to wear a badge to distinguish them from Muslims, and a special tax had to be paid, which was accompanied by a slap in the face. In the middle of the 18th century, Muslim fanaticism intensified, and many Jews were compelled to accept Islam. However, from 1826 to 1860, Bukhara was ruled by the powerful Emir Nasrullah Khan, and then by his son and grandson. And from this time until the Russian Revolution, Jews lived more or less peacefully in the region, as did my grandparents' families. Many prospered as merchants, traveling to Moscow on behalf of the Muslim population. They would buy cotton material printed to Muslim specification, such as hundreds of printed scarves ordered as gifts for wedding guests. And on their return to Bukhara, the merchants had to stop at the city gates to pay duty in gold sovereigns. When the emir learnt the names of these traders, he rewarded them for their contributions to his coffers. He ordered multicolored silk coats to be made, which he awarded to the merchants, those doing the most business receiving the greatest number of coats. Now on slide 4, we see one. Slide 4, Karen. This is one of those coats, which was given to my paternal grandfather. And in Bukharian, which is a language that we speak, it's known as a jomma. And that's all very highly colored, as you can see. And slide 5 is my paternal grandfather, who died in 1946. He survived the war and then died. He's wearing that jomma. It's a black and white picture, obviously. And on his head, he's wearing what we would call a Bukharian kippah, known as a topi, normally made with gold thread. And that picture was taken at the bris of my oldest brother. He was holding the baby. He was the sundek at that bris. Okay, in the next picture, I'll show you another picture, which is in color. On the right-hand side is my late father. This is taken in New York when he went to visit his sister. He's wearing one of the coats, the multicolored coats. I presume the coats from my grandfather were given out to the family. So my aunt, his sister, had these coats here. So that's my father on the right in the black and white coat with another typical kippah that they wore, which is the pyramid type. I've got a real one here, actually, which my grandmother made. This is what they look like. And then behind him is my uncle, married to my father's sister, also wearing another one of the coats. And there's another brother who's not wearing a coat, but they met in New York. And these coats are now worn traditionally at the Pesach Seder. So I think if we look at the next slide, we see my son, Alexander, wearing my grandfather's coat pre his own Seder. So I can remember as a child the excitement of my father donning this coat at the beginning of the Seder on the eve of Pesach, looking very grand at the top of the table. And now Alexander wears it at his Seder to continue the family tradition. He tells me it's a great talking point with all his guests who've never seen anything quite like it before. So there it's gone down the generations. So it was in fact my grandfather's, yes, it's gone down 3 generations. Anyway, okay. bit more about Bukhara. In 1921, the Bolsheviks asked the ruling emir to leave peacefully, and he agreed and departed with his wives and 40 children and a retinue of 200 men and families. He went into exile in Afghanistan, where he's believed to have died during the Second World War. Bukhara's climate is extreme, with temperatures rising to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in summer, when the sun shines constantly for 3 months, to very cold winters when the temperature can fall to -15, with snow covering the ground for 3 months. And this makes for very fertile earth, which is called black earth, Chornaya Zemlya. Bukharian Jews of my grandparents' and parents' generation were very well educated, primarily in Jewish matters, and the more successful ones also learned to adapt to changing scenarios.
I have a query on my pages.
Everything okay? Okay. At home, they would speak Bukharian, a language written in Hebrew script with words taken from Hebrew, Farsi, which is Iranian, and Russian. And as I said before, this is the language my parents spoke to one another at home if they didn't want us to understand what they were saying. But they also learnt other languages when the need arose. My paternal grandfather became a diplomat for Afghanistan because of the languages he could speak, something which saved the family when they had to leave Russia because of the revolution. My own father spoke 7 languages and my mother 4, which they picked up as they traveled from Bukhara and Tashkent to Europe. And the next couple of slides are just typical dresses and things that Bukharian people wore. So here's a typical dress that they would have worn, made out of silk, because it's on the silk route, Bukhara. And then the next one is another dress, here you are, and wearing a tupi. The women also would cover their hair with a hat for sometimes. And most of the clothes that you see from that area are very brightly coloured, and typical Bukharian food is also brightly coloured and highly spiced, all goes together with it. I think it's probably the sunshine that does it. Okay, let's get back to the book now. So it begins with my grandmother Adina's life in Kokand, where she was clearly very happy. Her family owned a shop selling material for women's dresses and children's clothes. And we're going to go to slide 10. I'm just going to read a little bit from the book. Here, and we go to slide 10. It's a picture of her father, Yehuda Menachemov. You notice that Menachem, it's Hebrew, Menachem, but they put the off on the end for the Russian bit. So my father was a tall, thin and calm man, devout and well respected. He had a small shop that sold material for women's dresses and children's clothes. In the mornings, he always got up to open the shop himself, although he had several assistants working for him. At that time, we were comfortably off. My father wasn't rich, but he earned enough to enable the family to live without financial worries. He had his own house with a garden adjoining the courtyard. He had beautiful daughters. The eldest, who was 17, was already married. Now, marriages in this part of the world were mostly arranged, although the man would often contrive to check out the prospective bride. And this is what happened to my grandmother. She soon became betrothed to Raphael Abramoft. They had only previously met with chaperones present, but he bribed a little brother with ice cream so that they could have some time alone together. It became a love match, and they married in the autumn of 1912. Our wedding day was fine. The sun still shone brightly through the leaves, which were already yellowing on the trees. Red gold leaves lay scattered on the ground. They glittered in the sunshine, giving the impression that the earth was covered in gold. Oh, what a beautiful time of year, I thought. I was happy the day was mine. I was getting married to a dearly beloved man who told me so many times that he would make me happy and that I would never want for anything. Our wedding was magnificent. I met Aron's parents as an innocent young girl. They took me to their hearts and told me how happy they were that their son had chosen me. Aron's family, so it was a traditional relationship. She supported him, my grandmother, in everything, and looked after the children who soon began to arrive. And my mother, Tamara, was born in 1915. Aron's family had a very successful wholesale business in Tashkent that imported goods from Europe. And after his marriage, his parents opened a branch for him in Kokand so that Adina could stay near to her family. When the First World War broke out, some goods became harder to import, but things really deteriorated only when the war was going badly for the Russians and the revolution broke out in 1917. When violence reached Kokand, Aron's father, who happened to be in Kokand for his partner's son's wedding, was brutally murdered by the Basmachi Kurbashi, a Muslim revolutionary group that opposed the Russians. Aron had moved his family to the suburbs so that they escaped harm, but their home was looted and burned, and this really marked the turning point in their lives. Slide 11 shows a picture of Raphael Abramoft, my grandfather's father, who was murdered. I'm just going to read a little bit there because this is when things take a different turn for everybody in the family. That was a time of utter sadness for us, how our lives had changed. Only the day before the fighting broke out, Aron and I had been so happy together. Now that day seemed to me to have happened long ago, like in a dream. When the news of Raphael's murder reached us, I sat still, lost in sorrowful thought. Aron went out without saying a word to me. My heart was heavy with regret that I could do nothing to help him. I didn't even know where he'd gone or what he was doing. I wondered how he was feeling now that his world had collapsed under his feet. That night was long and terrifying, leaving me exhausted by morning. I got up slowly. The whole day long, my head ached from weariness. I knew I had to control myself and be strong for the sake of my husband. I spent the whole day wandering about the house with tears pouring down my cheeks. At the same time, a feeling of determination grew up inside me. I decided I had to be stronger than Aron, and then I'd be able to help him. Before us lay a new and frightening life. What fate had in store for us, we didn't know. But I was determined that Aron and I would struggle to mend our shattered lives. Our life didn't only encompass my husband and me and my 3 little daughters, but his entire family, his mother and 9 brothers and sisters. Now they all depended on Aron as the oldest son of the family to help them rebuild their lives. After these terrible events, Aron decided that they had to join his mother in Tashkent. Her spacious house had been requisitioned, but she was allowed 2 rooms in it for her and her 9 children. The revolution brought famine, cholera, typhus, and death from hunger and cold. It was a struggle to find food, so Adina learnt to bake bread at home and to work sewing clothes for children and adults. And at last, Aron managed to obtain a sack of flour and set up a bakery. It was mobbed on opening, as no one had eaten white bread for a long time, and it was allowed to operate as a collective. They called it Oslcho in Russian, Hatzlacha in Hebrew. But this was short-lived. After Lenin died, there was a struggle in the party, and in 1928, Stalin emerged as leader. As soon as he took power, he launched a new policy, the liquidation of the kulaks. He seized capital and goods and nationalized factories and plants. At night, the secret police began to arrest the heads of families and to requisition houses and possessions. People again had to flee to avoid being flung into jail, and chaos returned to the country. Under Lenin, my grandfather and his brothers had managed to open another business, cleaning raw cotton and producing felt for boots and hats. My 2 uncles, David and Pinchas, were born during this time. The family had moved into a large house with a garden where they could grow vegetables and keep a cow for milk. The children were growing up and going to school. And by 1929, life had almost returned to normal. And then, one Friday afternoon, Aron told me that a trade inspector was coming to see us, to have a talk and to determine the amount of tax we should pay for that year. It seemed a little odd, but as tax demands were often made of us, we didn't think anything more about it. 2 men arrived at 7 o'clock in the morning. Aron opened the door to them. They entered, sat down, and began to talk. Aron showed them his account books. I brought them tea and left the room. They looked around, taking note of the furniture, carpets, and silver in the dresser. After drinking their tea, one of the men asked Aron the time. My husband pulled out his gold pocket watch to tell them. The man pointed to the watch and said, "Oh, what a beautiful pocket watch you have." Aron instantly responded, "Yes, it's the only thing I have left for my dead father, who was killed during the revolution. I carry it with me every day." One of the men then said, "Put it on the table, please." Aron was shocked and turned pale. Seeing this, they began to explain. "We've just come from your factory, which we have shut. We have sealed the doors and requisitioned it. You have no right to reopen it without our permission, nor do you have the right to touch your bank account." "Why are you doing this?" asked Aron. "I always pay my taxes." They shrugged their shoulders and continued to make an inventory of furniture, tables, chairs, and carpets. They examined the contents of the dresser through its glass front. Then they went into the bedroom where they noted everything down, even our quilts and pillows. Aron was ashen-faced, unable to understand what they were doing. He stood and watched them in silence, not believing his eyes. Then the men politely bade him goodbye and left. On December the 31st, New Year's Eve, my grandfather was warned by some Muslims who did business with him that there was to be a mass roundup of people that night. And as his name started with A.B., he was first on the list. The 31st of December was gala night at the opera, and in restaurants people were seeing in the new year. Sleighs ran about the town, their bells tinkling. From inside them you could hear tipsy young men singing loudly. It was a moonlit night with a hard frost. Snow lay 1/2 metre deep on the ground, sparkling in the moonlight. People were going home on foot in their boots and galoshes, breathing in the crystal night air and singing, not knowing that Stalin's agents were also going through the town, looking for homes where they would arrest capitalist heads of families. At 1 in the morning, there was a ring at the front door. I was prepared. I lay on my bed without sleeping, waiting while I hoped and prayed that they might not come to our house. I was so exhausted by fear that I could scarcely walk. I opened the door, and there stood 2 men in black coats and felt hats. They asked, "Is your husband Aron at home?" "My husband has left me and gone away, leaving me with 5 children and an empty house," I said. They wanted to search the flat. We had a dining room and a bedroom. My little son slept with me in the bedroom, and our 3 daughters slept on the floor in the dining room. The men went in, looked around, and went away without a word. I closed the front door and went to bed. My grandfather then decided it was too risky to go home, and so he went into hiding in the mountains for 6 months, disguised as a Muslim. During this time, my grandmother, like many other women, went through a civil divorce, which protected her and the family, as the Stalinists only persecuted male property owners. This was a time of utter sadness for the family, and so fearing for his life, my grandfather decided there was no alternative but to emigrate. He bid a tearful farewell to his mother, who remained in Tashkent for the rest of her life, reassuring her he would never forget her and promising to help her as much as he could, which he did. Aron went to Moscow after leaving his hiding place in the mountains, with the family following him by train, a journey of several days with very little to eat. From there, they journeyed to Leningrad, where they met up with Aron, who was overjoyed to see his wife and family again after 6 long months. It took several weeks of false starts and disappointment for their exit visas to eventually arrive in Leningrad, which would enable them to leave Russia. You may wonder how they managed to finance themselves during this time, and my mother told me that she and her older sister Susie swallowed diamonds, but my mother remained so frightened of the communists all her life that she wouldn't write about it when recounting her parents' life in the book. Their first stop after leaving Russia was Riga, where they were struck by the abundance of food and goods in the shops and the friendliness of the people. They then went on to Berlin, but they found it anti-Semitic. And so they went to Ghent in Belgium, where they stayed for a few months so that my mother and her sisters could continue their education and learn some French. And I think there's a picture of my mother's carte d'identité. For the next slide, slide 12. There's a picture of my mother. She's age 15 in 1931, just having left Russia and spending, I think they spent about 9 months in Ghent. But after a few months, they decided to move on again. And finally, they opted for Paris, where my grandfather set up a small shop. At first, they were hit by the Depression, so times were hard again. But life had to go on. In 1935, my mother married my father, Jacob Kulangiev, a young man from Bukhara who had made a similar journey, leaving his native Bukhara where he was born, then setting up home in Moscow until that was considered unsafe, then traveling to Berlin where he had his bar mitzvah, and then finally settling in Paris with his family. Or so he thought. For 2 years after his marriage in 1937, fearing German aggression, my father convinced my mother that they would be safer in London, where I and my 2 brothers were born. Of course, you couldn't just come to England, but there were other Bukharian Jews who'd set up home in England before them, who vouched for them, gave them a floor to sleep on and a job. And that's how they ended up in Stamford Hill, on their own, not knowing the language, and having left their nearest and dearest in Paris. And I think the next slide is a picture of my parents' wedding photo. And that was 1935 in Paris. So during the Phoney War, both my parents' families left Paris to go south, but when they returned, they were caught by the invading German army. Aron, his 2 brothers, and his oldest son, my uncle David, were rounded up together with my father's family and many Jewish men and taken to the Drancy internment camp, a precursor of being sent to Auschwitz. Miraculously, they and 150 other Bukharian Jews were saved by the extraordinary intervention of their family doctor, Asaf Achilvi. He managed, against all the odds, to get Bukharian Jews, who were known as Djigoutis, declared a racial group rather than a religious group, which excluded them from the German anti-Jewish laws. The book shows letters from the Iranian consul dated October 1940, confirming that the Jews of Bukhara are of non-Jewish race. And then in August 41, there's a notification from the German authorities that for the time being, no definite steps should be taken with regard to the Djigoutis. And then in January 42, there's a notification from the Commissariat Général aux Questions Juives, which states that the Djigoutis are not of the Jewish race and that anti-Jewish measures do not apply to them. Lists of Djigoutis were drawn up with 150 names on them, my grandfather Aron being number 42, followed by the rest of the family. The bravery and persistence of Dr. Achilvi, despite the constant fear of being arrested himself, saved the lives of 150 Bukharian Jews. My mother writes sparingly about this episode in the memoir, so I decided to include Dr. Achilvi's own testament as an appendix in the book. And when you read it, it's quite chilling. It's entitled The Djigouti Affair and was published by Israel's Holocaust Center, Yad Vashem, in 1967. And I'd just like to take 2 quotes from here, from Dr. Achilvi's testimony, which particularly about my family here. So my father Aron is referred here as Arkady, not as Aron. I don't know why, but and I just read what happened to them, what he writes about the family. The 3 brothers A, which is Abramoft, Arkady, Albert, and Daniel, and also Arkady's son, David, a young man of 20, still remained in Drancy. I applied to the prefecture to release them, but the reply was, "We do not detain these protégés of yours. You will have to apply to Dr. Schultz at the Chamber of Deputies." I applied to him and he said to me, "Go to the camp at Drancy yourself and prove to them that your Djigoutis are not liable to deportation and they will be released." Heaven alone knows where I got the necessary courage and willpower to shake off my fear and go on the following day, February the 6th, to the gate of the Drancy camp, I asked to speak to the commandant as the chairman of the Djiboutis who'd been sent by Dr. Schultz to release the 4 Djiboutis of Afghan origin who were confined in the camp. To my amazement, I was received by the camp commandant. To my question why the Afghans were held in the camp, although they were not in a state of war with Germany, he replied, "They're not Afghans, they're Jews." I explained to him that these people were recognized by the German authorities as not belonging to the Jewish race, although they were of the Jewish religion. I added that I had with me documents confirming my statements for each of them. He read the documents, thought a little, and then telephoned to the Chamber of Deputies. He received the answer in German that the file was in order and that 3 of the 4 Djiboutis were to be released. The 4th, the young David A., was being held for something else and must be transferred to the suspects' camp. When Arkady and Albert entered the office and heard that they were being released, but that young David was to be transferred to another camp, I beheld a shocking spectacle. Arkady fell on his knees, screaming that his dear son was lost and would be hanged. For the first time throughout the Djibouti affair, I lost my temper. I gave him a slap in order to bring him back to reality. I explained to him in Iranian, in the presence of the commandant and the surprised soldiers, that he must keep quiet and use the unexpected opportunity vouchsafed him and his 2 brothers to get out of this loathsome camp safe and sound. They would take care of his son also. He calmed down and left the camp, weeping with his brother, Albert. And then just one more bit about my uncle David. And I must say, when I wrote this book, I gave one of these books to my cousin who lives in Paris, and it's her father, David, and she never knew this story. He'd obviously never told her. So I did warn her before she read the book. Anyway, this is what happened to David. As I had been told at Drancy, one of the 4 representatives of the Enlarged Abramoft family, young David, had been transferred to the camp for suspects where he was under special surveillance. His father, Arkady, came to me every day for 3 months, weeping and imploring me and my wife to intervene through the German authorities to release his son. "Doctor," he said to me, "if you don't get my son out of there, my wife and I will die." I could no longer evade the issue. I was president, and that meant I was the only person who could do something. So I decided to act. The Georgians Committee then suggested I appeal to Mr. Korkia. He received me courteously and humanely, and having heard me in a friendly fashion, he replied, "I can't intervene personally on behalf of this young man because I represent the Georgians and not the Djiboutis. Go directly to the people who are keeping him in confinement and explain his case clearly and simply. I'm certain you will succeed if all you have told me is true." When I asked to whom I should apply and how I should get in, this charming man replied with his characteristic good nature, "Here is my visiting card with the name and address that interest you written on it." I read the address on the card. Obersturmführer Christian, Avenue Foch 86. My head whirled. I said, "This is the Gestapo headquarters. Shall I be able to get out of there alive?" He replied with a smile, "Go and explain your case. Even if you don't obtain the release of young man, you yourself will come out safely because I'm protecting you." I couldn't sleep the night after this meeting. I couldn't decide whether to go or not. I couldn't talk to anybody, especially my wife, about this matter and the risk it involved. But I understood that the life of this young man was worth the risk I was undertaking. The following morning, therefore, I presented myself at 86 Avenue Foch and asked to speak to Obersturmführer Christian, producing Mr. Korker's visiting card. The sentinel telephoned inside, signaled me to enter, and gave me a slip on which was written, "Entered 9:15. My heart was beating violently, but I retained my outward calm. I was received by a man of about 40 in civilian garb, who seemed dry and reserved, but was quite polite and asked me first if I understood German. On my answering in the negative, he said in fair French, "They phoned to tell me what you've come for, but nothing can be done about it. This young man will remain confined in a camp as a hostage for the duration, and I can't reveal the reason." "Sir," I replied, "the war is raging all over Europe, and you will understand that I would prefer not to endanger myself and my family were I not convinced of the innocence of this young man. I wouldn't be intervening on his behalf. As the president of this small community, it is my duty to prove to you that his imprisonment is entirely unjustified. What, in fact, are you charging him with? He looked fixedly at me and after a moment's thought replied, we know that this young man is opposed to the German army. I replied with a smile, you should know that he's nothing more than an apple salesman in his father's shop. He doesn't speak French, German, Russian, or English. I'm sure he belongs to no group or political party, and he's too much of a coward to disobey anyone or to refuse to fulfill an order. He's even less capable of doing any harm by an active outburst. I will tell you the story of his arrest and why he's detained in the suspects' camp. It all happened at the end of November last year, the same day on which a merchant well known in Paris was taken by men posing as policemen and liquidated in an underground passage. Police headquarters then published a proclamation saying that people were only to obey the orders of the police carrying a special card issued by the Préfecture. And in case of doubt, they were to communicate with the police secours in order to check the reliability of the order of detention. The same afternoon, a one-armed man in civilian dress came to the shop where the young man worked and without prior warning seized him by the collar and began to drag him towards the door. His sisters and a number of customers protested and even tried to drag him away, demanding that the man show the warrant of arrest. He replied, I don't have to show you anything. I'm carrying out orders and I'm not accountable to you. One of the customers telephoned the police secours, and when they came, he showed the required confirmation and concluded, you'll see what sort of report I shall put in on all of this now. You'll rot in a concentration camp and never come out, all of you. And as you see, sir, you are merely carrying out the private revenge of this policeman because the report he submitted was purposely and maliciously inflated and all the details were invented. Herr Christian listened intently and said, I shall check the truth of what you say. And if it is found to be correct, the young man will be home tomorrow. But if it turns out this is all your invention, we shall send you to join him on a charge of false testimony. I could do no more than bow my head. I rose to go out, and then he burst out laughing and said, they won't let you out. The blood froze in my veins. Then after a very long minute, he added, take this slip that shows what time you left, and by showing it, you will be able to leave. I was so shaken that I nearly stumbled and fell as I went down the stairs, and I was walking like a drunkard. When I reached home, I suffered an attack of nerves that caused great concern to those about me. Precisely at noon the following day, Raphael Abramoft was home. His family's joy was boundless. Just a digression from the book for a moment. When I think of the journeys that my parents' families took from Bukharian and Tashkent and how they had to adapt to different cultures and languages in all the countries that they temporarily stayed in, I marvel at their resilience and the normal childhood that I had. When I look at the photos of my parents and how European they look after having started out from Central Asia, it's only now that I'm a bit older and have experienced life a little, that I realise how difficult life must have been for them. And it perhaps explains how precious we, the children, were to them. The fear of losing their lives or their loved ones must have stayed with them all their lives. Also, how difficult it must have been for my parents, who were in relative safety in England during the war, whilst information about what was happening across the channel to their family in France was sparse. I know they were able to get occasional telegrams from a diplomat colleague of my paternal grandfather, who actually got stranded in England during the war and lived with my parents during that time, who was part of the Afghan legation in Vichy, assuring my parents that their respective families were safe. The next slide is the two of the telegrams. Slide 13. So here we have telegrams from Islam Bek. He's a friend. We used to visit him in Paris whenever we went to say thank you for what he did for the family. One in May and one in October 1942. I don't know if you can see, there's a censor on it. It's been censored by the German press or the post office, whatever. And the second one says, toute votre famille et famille, votre beau-père sont en bonne santé. All your family and your in-law family are in good health. Vos parents demandent nouvelles. Your own parents are asking for news of votre père, your father. This is written to my father. So his father, and frère and épouse, and my father had another brother who was living in London at the time as well. Islam Bek, Afghan legation. So it was sent. So at least they had a little bit of information about what was going on in Paris while they were in London. And the next slide, slide 14. On the right is Dr. Ochildi, Asaf Ochildi. He's the one who saved these 150 Bukharians, and his wife is next to him. And on the extreme left is my mother, with my oldest brother, Eddie, in the front. He was 6 at this time. He was born during the war in 1940 in England. So after the war, my mum went to say thank you, basically, to Dr. Ochildi. Again, we used to visit him very regularly until he died, when we used to go to Paris. So afterwards, my grandfather and his brothers and son, after they were released from Hull C, the men in the family still feared for their lives, and only the women family members served in the shop. Eventually, the war ended, and my grandparents lived the tranquil life together that I remember. Aron died in 1970, and my mother records Adina's heartbreak and the reflection on the 60 years that they shared together with all its ups and downs. So slide 15, I think, is a picture of my grandparents in Paris. Yes, and I took that photo because I used to go every year to Paris, and this year I was going to go straight to Israel with a friend on a trip in 1970, and I decided I had to go to Paris first to visit them, as I'd always done. And I took that photo, and in fact, my grandfather died in that November, so and that was in August. I'm very pleased that I actually went to see them, and he's wearing one of those Bukharian coats. There, that's in their flat. The next picture, I've just shown a few pictures of what's in the book. The next picture, this is my mother on the left and her sister Dora, taken in 1934, just to show how they managed to change from being Central Asian to quite looking European, I think you would say. And then the next slide, 17, is my grandfather also, who obviously spent even longer in Central Asia. And this is him in 1936 in Paris, wearing that, quite distinguished little hat there, and a suit and tie. Didn't look like that after the war, I must say. Lost a tremendous amount of weight, but anyway. Okay, and then the last slide we come to is the book cover again, and it's my grandparents, as I showed. The book title is From Tashkent to Paris, and the outside of the book is a Bukharian dress, which I used to make the cover, the highly covered thing. And there they are sitting having tea, like European people, in their flat in Paris. And I tried to combine that to make the book cover. I'd just like to conclude, hope I haven't taken up too much time, by reading the foreword to the book, which explains my mother's philosophy on life, which stood her and her family in good stead throughout her life. Now, this is what she says. If at some time in your life you find yourself in difficulties and fear that you will never overcome them, when you begin to lose your hope, strength, self-confidence, will and faith in God, then read this book, not once, but many times over. And it will help you understand that however desperate the situation may seem, your life may change for the better. When you start to fear that the end is near and that there's nothing more to be done, after you've tried various means of escape and you are tired in body and soul, suddenly some idea or chance meeting will occur, and suddenly everything will change. Fresh hope will spring up in your heart. You will strive again with renewed energy, and your life will be sure to improve. As you pull yourself out of your difficulties, you'll even find humor in the situation and say to yourself, how could all that have happened? Why didn't I think of the solution earlier? Sometimes you seem to trot through life on horseback, and at other times the horse seems to drag you along behind it. But there's always the hope that you will leap onto that horse and gallop away without a backward glance. And that's it. That's the end of it. Okay, I don't know if anyone has any questions or anything that I might be able to answer.